Sister Claire stood at the window of her office, her weathered hands clasped tightly behind her back as she gazed out at the sprawling grounds of St. Redemption's Rehabilitation Center. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, giving the peaceful scene an ominous edge that matched her troubled thoughts. Claire's once auburn hair had faded to a steely gray, pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated the deep lines etched around her piercing blue eyes. Her tall, lean frame was draped in the traditional black habit of her order, a stark contrast to the colorful autumn foliage beyond the window. She turned as a knock sounded at her door, composing her features into a mask of calm benevolence. "Come in," she called, her voice carrying the faintest hint of an Irish lilt. Jack Mercer entered, his imposing frame filling the doorway. He was one of St. Redemption's older residents, his rugged good looks marred by a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline. His dark eyes, once cold and empty, now held a spark of life that both pleased and unsettled Claire. "Sister Claire," he said, ducking his head in deference, "I wanted to thank you for recommending me for the groundskeeping position. It means a lot to have your trust." Claire smiled, ignoring the twinge of unease in her gut. "You've earned it, Jack. Your progress has been remarkable these past 6 months." As Jack launched into an enthusiastic description of his plans for the center's gardens, Claire found her mind wandering. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off about Jack's transformation. His violent outbursts had ceased almost overnight, replaced by an eerie calm that sent chills down her spine. Later that night, long after the center had fallen silent, Claire sat at her desk, poring over Jack's file. The gruesome details of his crimes, a string of brutal assaults that had left his victims disfigured and traumatized, made her stomach churn. Yet nothing in his history suggested the level of violence seen in the recent murders plaguing their small town. The first body had been discovered 3 weeks after Jack's arrival at St. Redemption's. Claire remembered the day vividly. The acrid smell of blood and decay that had permeated the air, the flies buzzing around the mutilated corpse of local businessman Thomas Reeves. His tongue had been cut out, his eyes gouged from their sockets, and a crude cross carved into his chest. 2 more bodies had followed in quick succession, each bearing the same grotesque signature. Claire had tried to convince herself it was mere coincidence, but as she stared at the crime scene photos spread across her desk, doubt gnawed at her conscience. A sudden noise outside her window made Claire start. She peered into the darkness, her heart racing, but saw only shadows. Shaking her head at her own paranoia, she turned back to her desk and froze. There, lying atop Jack's file, was a small white feather. Claire's blood ran cold as memories she'd long suppressed came rushing back. The sound of breaking glass, screams piercing the night, the metallic tang of blood on her tongue. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone but stopped short. Who could she call? The police? And tell them what? That she suspected one of her patients based on nothing more than a feeling and a feather? No, she decided. She needed proof. Over the next few weeks, Claire watched Jack like a hawk, searching for any sign that might betray his true nature. But he remained the model of rehabilitation, his gentle demeanor and ready smile winning over even the most hardened staff members. It was during this time that Claire began to notice subtle changes in her own behavior. She found herself making excuses to be near Jack, her eyes drawn to the powerful muscles that rippled beneath his shirt as he worked in the gardens. She caught herself imagining the feel of his calloused hands on her skin, and the shame that followed these thoughts was almost unbearable. As Claire grappled with her conflicting emotions, the body count in town continued to rise. Each new victim bore some connection to St. Redemption's: a former guard, a volunteer, a delivery driver. The police were baffled, but Claire felt the noose of suspicion tightening around the center. It all came to a head on a stormy night in late October. Claire had been working late, the howling wind and lashing rain matching her tumultuous thoughts. As she prepared to leave, a flash of lightning illuminated a figure standing in the courtyard below her window. Heart pounding, Claire raced down the stairs and out into the rain. She found Jack kneeling in the mud, his clothes soaked and his hands covered in blood. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "What have you done?" He looked up at her, his eyes wild and feverish. "I did it for you, sister," he said, his words slurring together. "I killed them all for you." Claire felt the world tilt on its axis as Jack continued, describing in horrific detail how he'd stalked and murdered each victim. With each word, memories Claire had buried for decades clawed their way to the surface. She saw herself as a young novice, sneaking out of the convent to meet her lover. She relived the terror of that night when they were discovered, the brutal beating that followed, and the moment she'd snapped, plunging a broken bottle into her attacker's throat. The subsequent cover-up orchestrated by the church had haunted Claire for years, driving her to dedicate her life to rehabilitating lost souls like Jack. But now, as she listened to his confession, she realized the true depth of her failure. "You don't remember me, do you?" Jack asked, a twisted smile playing on his lips. "I was there that night, Sister Claire. I saw what you did, and I've spent every day since then trying to be worthy of you." Claire staggered back, her mind reeling. How could she have forgotten? The boy hiding in the shadows, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe as she'd stood over her victim's body, blood dripping from her hands. In that moment, Claire understood the terrible truth. She had created Jack, molded him into the instrument of her long-suppressed rage and guilt. Every murder he'd committed had been an act of devotion, a twisted attempt to win her approval. As sirens wailed in the distance, Claire made her decision. She knelt beside Jack, taking his blood-stained hands in hers. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. "I failed you. I failed them all." Jack's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with understanding. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. "We can still be together," he murmured, "just like I always dreamed." Claire closed her eyes, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. When she opened them again, her gaze was clear and determined. "Yes," she said softly, "we can." In one fluid motion, she grabbed Jack's head and twisted sharply. The crack of his neck breaking was lost in a clap of thunder. As Jack's lifeless body slumped to the ground, Claire stood, her black habit plastered to her skin by the relentless rain. She looked down at her hands, now stained with blood once more, and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She turned towards the approaching police cars, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. A small smile played on her lips as she raised her arms in surrender. At last, she would face the consequences of her actions, all of them. In the days that followed, the truth about Sister Claire and Jack Mercer sent shockwaves through the community. The lurid details of their shared past and the trail of bodies left in their wake dominated headlines for weeks. St. Redemption's Rehabilitation Center was shuttered, its remaining residents transferred to other facilities. The church distanced itself from Claire, denouncing her actions and claiming ignorance of her violent history. As for Claire herself, she offered no defense at her trial. She sat silently in the courtroom, her face a mask of serenity as the prosecution laid out the evidence against her. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she simply shook her head. The judge, visibly shaken by the brutality of the crimes, sentenced Claire to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led from the courtroom, reporters clamored for a statement, desperate to understand the mind of the killer nun. Claire paused at the door, turning to face the sea of cameras and microphones. For a moment, her mask slipped, revealing the tormented soul beneath. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for I have sinned." With those words, Sister Claire disappeared into the bowels of the justice system, leaving behind a legacy of pain, betrayal, and the shattered illusion of redemption. The small town she had once called home would never be the same, its innocence forever tainted by the darkness that had lurked behind the walls of St. Redemption's. In the years that followed, Claire's case became the subject of countless true crime documentaries and psychological studies. Experts debated whether she had been a victim of circumstance or a manipulative sociopath, while conspiracy theorists spun wild tales of church cover-ups and government experiments gone wrong. But for those who had known Claire, the staff and residents of St. Redemption's, the families of her victims, and the few who remembered the idealistic young novice she had once been, the truth was far more complex and painful. They were left to grapple with the knowledge that even the most seemingly righteous among us can harbor the darkest of secrets, and that the line between salvation and damnation is often blurrier than we'd like to believe. As for Claire herself, she found a strange sort of peace behind bars. In the stark confines of her cell, she no longer had to pretend to be something she was not. She spent her days in quiet contemplation, offering what comfort she could to her fellow inmates while silently atoning for the lives she had destroyed. And on quiet nights, when the prison fell silent and the moonlight streamed through the barred windows, Claire would close her eyes and see Jack's face. In those moments, she allowed herself to imagine a different ending, one where they had found redemption together, where love had triumphed over the darkness that consumed them both. But as the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, Claire would open her eyes and face the reality of her choices. She had made her bed, and now she would lie in it, alone, forgotten, and eternally unforgiven.